I tried to warn you all, but did anyone listen? The truth has a way of hiding behind smiles, behind carefully crafted headlines, behind the glittering perfection of a public persona. And when someone finally decides to speak up, to pull back the curtain, the world freezes. That moment is here. Trevor Engelson, Meghan Markle's ex-husband, the man who once loved her, trusted her, and saw her in ways nobody else could, has revealed details that no one knew. Details that could completely change the story you thought you knew. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. You've seen the headlines. You've watched the interviews. You've heard the rumors. But nothing prepares you for hearing the story straight from someone who is on the inside. Someone who lived the private life, not the public performance. And it's not just gossip. These revelations strike at the heart of everything the media, the public, even the royal family believes about Meghan Markle. So why now? Why Trevor Engelson? And why should you care? Trevor Engelson isn't just a former husband. He's a producer, a man who has seen the highs and lows of Hollywood fame, someone who knows how narratives are spun and stories are shaped. And yet, when it comes to Meghan Markle, he says the narrative was never the full truth. He saw things that no one else did. He noticed patterns. He observed behaviors that were subtle, yet revealing. And for years, he kept quiet. He tried to make sense of it all. He tried to process it. But eventually, the truth demanded to be told. Let's be honest, relationships are complicated. They're messy. They're full of contradictions. Love can be a blindfold. But what Trevor is sharing goes beyond the usual heartbreaks or Hollywood drama. These are details that, if true, could make you question everything you thought you knew about Meghan Markle, not just as a public figure, but as a person. Imagine dating someone who, in public, appears to be the kindest, most charming person in the room. Everyone loves her. Everyone admires her. And then, slowly, in private, you start noticing inconsistencies. Small things at first, a comment that doesn't quite match the mood, a story that changes slightly each time it's told. The smile that masks frustration, the laughter that hides a sharper edge. You shrug it off. You think, maybe I'm reading too much into it. But then the signs grow bigger, the patterns undeniable. And that's where Trevor found himself. Trevor Engelson doesn't just recount the past. He gives context, insight, and reflection. He shares the little moments that seemed insignificant at the time, but, in hindsight, were warnings. Moments that felt ordinary then, but now, under the lens of everything that has happened since, look like pieces of a larger puzzle. You might be asking yourself, what could he possibly reveal that's new? After all, Meghan Markle has been dissected from every angle for years. Books, documentaries, podcasts, endless media cycles. But here's the thing. No one has been in the same position as Trevor Engelson. No one has experienced her world intimately, personally, daily. No one has watched her navigate ambition, public attention, and private relationships with the combination of affection, caution, and, sometimes, manipulation that he describes. And it's not just about personal quirks. These revelations touch on relationships, trust, and choices. They intersect with fame, power, and influence. They challenge the sanitized version of the fairy tale romance that the media built and the public embraced. And that's why this matters. Because the world hasn't just watched Meghan Markle. The world has believed her story. And if Trevor Engelson's account holds any weight, some of what we believed might be incomplete. Let's pause for a moment. Think about your own life for a second. Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to discover layers you never saw? Secrets they carried quietly, carefully? Now imagine those secrets being revealed on a global stage. Imagine every detail dissected, every behavior analyzed, every nuance laid bare. That's what Trevor Engelson has done, not maliciously, but honestly. Reluctantly, yes, but honestly. And it's not just shocking. It's emotional, dramatic, and, frankly, unsettling. From the very first moments of their relationship, Trevor noticed things that didn't always add up. The charm, the charisma, the magnetic pull of someone who seemed too perfect to be true. And yet, within the same moments, there were glimpses of tension, of guardedness, of a drive that wasn't always visible to the public eye. He describes it as a duality, one side radiant, captivating, almost ethereal, the other calculating, strategic, private. And while most would dismiss these differences as normal relationship dynamics, for someone who lived inside that world, the contradictions were impossible to ignore. You might think this is typical celebrity drama. You might assume this is just another Hollywood breakup story, but it isn't. Trevor Engelson's revelations are deeply personal, revealing the inner workings of a relationship with someone whose public image has been meticulously curated. These aren't the stories you read in tabloids. They're moments witnessed firsthand, emotions felt, realizations experienced in real time. And they paint a picture that's far more complex than most people expect. Here's the first shock. Trevor Engelson says he tried to warn others. He tried to communicate what he was seeing. He tried to share insights, subtleties, behaviors that, in hindsight, were red flags. And yet, nobody seemed to understand, or perhaps they didn't want to. The allure of a public figure, the charm, the glamour, the story of a fairy tale romance. It blinded people. It blinded friends, family, even those closest to him. He watched as people embraced the narrative, unaware that there were layers beneath, some of which were troubling, others simply misunderstood. This is where the story takes a dramatic turn. The world saw Meghan Markle as a rising star, a future royal, a figure of elegance and poise. But Trevor Engelson saw the contradictions, the private struggles, the moments that didn't fit the public narrative. And he's here to tell you about them. Not to shame, not to attack, but to reveal truths that he believes the world deserves to know. So why should you care? Because understanding this story isn't just about gossip. It's about perspective. It's about seeing how narratives are shaped, how public images are constructed, and how personal experiences, sometimes hidden, can change everything you thought you knew. It's about realizing that love, trust, and relationships are complicated, and sometimes the people closest to you see things you don't. And that leads to the question that hangs over the entire narrative. What did Trevor Engelson see that no one else did? What details, what behaviors, what patterns revealed a side of Meghan Markle that had never been documented or discussed before? The answer isn't simple. It's layered. It's shocking. It's emotional. And it's going to challenge how you view the story you've been told for years. But here's the thing. This is only the beginning. Because what Engelson shares goes beyond just a personal account. It touches on relationships, media, perception, fame, and power. It reveals the intricate dance between public image and private reality. And as you hear the details, as you learn the stories he's held back until now, you'll realize just how complex the truth really is. Have you ever been in a relationship that felt like a dream, until the dream started showing cracks? That's exactly where Trevor Engelson found himself when he and Meghan Markle were navigating the early days of their engagement. The world saw a storybook romance, a handsome producer and a rising actress, seemingly perfect together. But behind the velvet curtains and the Instagram-worthy smiles, the reality was far more complicated. The first time Trevor really noticed something was off, it wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. A comment here, a glance there, a tiny shift in tone that didn't match the warmth of her smile. At first, he brushed it off. Everyone has quirks. Everyone has off days. But as the days turned into months, the quirks became patterns. The off days became recurring behaviors. And for someone who was supposed to be sharing a life with her, the patterns couldn't be ignored. Early on, Meghan presented herself as charming, self-assured, even nurturing. She had this ability to captivate a room, to make everyone feel seen. But Engelson began to notice how much control she exerted over the narrative of her life. Even small decisions were carefully managed, carefully crafted. Every story she told seemed polished, as if even her private life was a performance. And that's where the first seeds of tension were planted. Trevor started asking himself questions he wasn't ready to answer. Why did every conversation feel like it had a hidden agenda? Why did compliments sometimes feel like tests? Why did minor disagreements escalate into subtle but pointed criticisms? At first, he told himself it was just stress, the pressures of Hollywood, the natural challenges of a high-profile relationship. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being observed, analyzed, and measured in ways that went beyond normal relationship dynamics. It wasn't just about behavior, it was about contradictions. Meghan could be incredibly warm in public, radiating positivity, but then cold or distant in private moments. She would laugh at one joke, Then a similar joke later would elicit annoyance. She seemed to have multiple layers, multiple faces, and it was hard to know which one was real. Trevor realized that relationships are complicated, but living with someone whose persona constantly shifted was exhausting. It was like loving two different people at once and never knowing which one you were getting. And yet, despite the tension, the chemistry was undeniable. Engelson was drawn to her energy, her confidence, her ambition. He tells stories of moments that felt magical. Shared laughter over late-night conversations, walks through quiet streets, small gestures that made him feel seen and loved. But those moments were always fleeting, often interrupted by a quiet calculation or a subtle reminder that he wasn't the only one steering the ship. What made it even more complicated was the public attention. Every move they made together was scrutinized by fans, friends, and eventually, the media. Trevor says he quickly learned that the pressure of being watched magnified every small tension, every contradiction, every misstep. It was one thing to navigate a normal relationship. It was another entirely to do so under the weight of an audience that expected perfection. He also noticed how carefully Meghan managed perceptions, not just of the public, but of friends and family. People who were once close would suddenly be distanced, and new allies brought into her orbit. She was strategic in her connections, selective in her confidence. Trevor began to understand that relationships for her weren't just emotional, they were tactical. And while some might admire that kind of intelligence, for someone living inside it, it could feel suffocating. Then came the small incidents that, in hindsight, were unmistakable signs of larger patterns. The subtle dismissals of his feelings, the calculated responses to questions, the way she would retell stories in a way that subtly positioned herself as the hero or the victim. At first, he rationalized these moments, telling himself, maybe I'm imagining things. Maybe this is just how she navigates the world. But the intuition he couldn't shake told him otherwise. The engagement itself was a turning point. On paper, it was perfect. Photos, parties, celebrations, a ring sparkling under perfectly curated lights. But in private, Engelson noticed tension, moments of unease that no one else saw. Conversations that should have been intimate felt transactional. Decisions about wedding plans, family involvement, even day-to-day choices were layered with hidden meanings. He realized that the fairy tale narrative everyone celebrated wasn't the story he was living, and the contradictions kept piling up. Meghan could be tender one moment, then distant the next, generous with praise, then subtly undermining, loving and yet demanding. Trevor describes it as a pendulum swinging wildly, leaving him constantly off balance. And the emotional toll was heavy. He loved her, truly, deeply, but loving someone isn't always enough when the love is intertwined with manipulation, strategy, and contradictions that feel impossible to navigate. Engelson also noticed the first cracks in trust. He recounts moments where small lies, omissions, or reframing of events made him question reality. Not the obvious, dramatic betrayals you read about in tabloids, but the subtle, almost imperceptible things that, over time, create a sense of instability. It's that slow erosion of certainty that he says was the hardest to endure. Because if you can't trust your partner in the private, unguarded moments, what do you have left? Audience, let me ask you. Have you ever felt that someone you trusted could be wearing a mask? That every smile hides a calculation, every word carries a hidden meaning? That was Trevor Engelson's reality during the engagement. He loved the person he thought he knew, but he increasingly realized he might have only known a version carefully curated for him and for the world. And yet, there were moments that felt genuine, unrepeatable moments that made him cling to hope. Quiet mornings over coffee, shared jokes that revealed vulnerability, gestures of kindness that seemed authentic. These moments created a tension, a push and pull that made leaving or confronting the truth impossible. Love can blind you. Love can convince you that what you see isn't real, or that inconsistencies are just quirks, just flaws, just human imperfections. But sometimes, the signs are unmistakable, and Trevor began to see them. He tried to reconcile these contradictions, to understand her world, to find a middle ground. But as time went on, the tension between public persona and private reality became impossible to ignore. Every engagement, every dinner, Every conversation seemed layered with an unspoken game, a complexity that wasn't visible to friends, to family, to the public. And the deeper he looked, the more he realized he wasn't just witnessing quirks or human imperfections. He was witnessing a pattern, a consistency that revealed an unexpected side of someone he had loved. And that's where the first real turning point occurred. The moment when Trevor Engelson realized that this relationship, as intoxicating and dazzling as it seemed, had undercurrents that he could no longer ignore. The charming woman everyone admired, the one he had believed in, defended, and loved, was revealing facets that were darker, more calculated, and far more complex than anyone expected. He started documenting these moments mentally, remembering conversations, reflecting on incidents that now seemed prescient. Every joke that felt slightly off, every remark that hinted at strategy rather than sentiment, every moment of control or subtle manipulation was cataloged in his mind. Because Trevor knew something others didn't. He had to be honest with himself, even if nobody else would see the signs. And just when he thought he had begun to understand the patterns, just when he thought he had reconciled the duality of love and contradiction, the engagement took a dramatic turn. A moment so revealing, so unexpected, that it left him questioning everything. He realized that what he had seen in private, what had made him uneasy, what had seemed like small inconsistencies, was part of something much larger. Something that would ripple far beyond their personal relationship and eventually into the public eye. Have you ever wondered what a life lived under a microscope really feels like? Trevor Engelson did. And he'll tell you, the truth is far from the sparkling photos, the perfect smiles, the red carpet glamour. It's messy. It's complicated. It's exhausting. And for someone like Meghan Markle, whose every move was scrutinized, who had an entire public waiting to admire, judge, or dissect her, private life often looked very different from what the world believed. The world saw elegance. They saw charm. They saw confidence. They didn't see the tension simmering beneath the surface. Engelson describes nights when the glitz faded, when they were alone, and the cracks in the perfection began to appear. Conversations that should have been casual were layered with subtext. Moments that should have been relaxed carried a sense of calculation. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but it was there. He noticed it in small things. The way a compliment was sometimes returned with a test, the way minor inconveniences could trigger disproportionate reactions, the way smiles occasionally felt rehearsed. These weren't the kind of red flags you could point out immediately. They were the kind that, over time, eroded comfort and stability. The world didn't see it. Even friends didn't see it. But Trevor, living it, feeling it every day, couldn't ignore it. Hollywood is a world of performance, where charm and charisma often mask truth. But what Trevor found unique about Meghan wasn't simply the ability to perform. It was how she seemed to live her life as a performance. Even in private moments, there was a rhythm, a polish, a careful construction that made it difficult to know when she was genuine and when she was performing. And that's what started to weigh heavily on him. It wasn't always dark. There were moments of tenderness, of laughter, of connection. They shared jokes, conversations, plans for the future. There were smiles that felt authentic, gestures that felt real. But they were fleeting, often interrupted by a subtle tension that hung in the air, an invisible line that neither could cross without consequences. Engelson began to feel as though he was navigating a delicate dance, one where a wrong step could unravel the entire dynamic. The dichotomy between public and private was stark. On one hand, Meghan's public persona was warm, confident, and almost magnetic. People were drawn to her charm. On the other, private moments could be icy, calculated, precise. It was a contrast that became harder to reconcile over time. Engelson began to ask himself questions he wasn't prepared to answer. Was the public persona simply a mask? Were the private moments the real her, or a different mask entirely? And then there were the contradictions. A laugh that seemed genuine one day, forced the next. A compliment followed by subtle criticism. Moments of generosity juxtaposed with moments of control. Engelson noticed patterns forming, patterns that revealed strategy, calculation, and control, interwoven with genuine emotion. It created a push-and-pull dynamic. He loved her, but he was constantly on edge, trying to decode behavior, trying to protect himself emotionally while remaining invested. Trevor also observed how the media amplified certain behaviors. Everything was scrutinized, every outfit, every comment, every interaction. But what the public didn't see was the private fatigue, the small frustrations, the way small misunderstandings could become amplified in the bubble of scrutiny. Engelson noticed that Meghan navigated this world with precision, carefully curating her image, controlling access, and managing perception in a way that most people never realized. Even in moments of intimacy, Engelson felt a distance he couldn't bridge. He describes conversations where he sought vulnerability, where he hoped to connect on a deeper level, only to find that she responded with strategy, deflection, or subtle manipulation. It wasn't overt, it was artful. And over time, it created a sense of instability, of never quite knowing where he stood or how to respond. But there were also moments that made him doubt himself. Moments where her warmth and charm reminded him why he fell in love in the first place. Quiet mornings, shared laughter, late-night talks where the world outside seemed to vanish. These moments made it hard to step back, hard to acknowledge the patterns he was beginning to see. Love, he realized, was a powerful force, but love doesn't always provide clarity. Sometimes, it clouds judgment, convincing you that inconsistency is merely complexity, that tension is merely passion. Trevor also noticed how carefully Meghan navigated her social circles. Certain friends were welcomed with warmth, others kept at a distance. Conversations were sometimes controlled, sometimes open, and Engelson began to see that relationships for her were rarely spontaneous. They were strategic. Connections were nurtured based on perceived value, loyalty, and utility. It wasn't about malice, he insists. It was simply the way she operated. But for someone living inside that system, it could feel isolating, confusing, even emotionally taxing. Audience, think about this. Have you ever felt like you were watching a performance unfold in real life? Someone whose energy was magnetic, whose charm was undeniable, but whose private reality never quite aligned with the public image. That was Trevor Engelson's daily experience. He loved her. But loving someone isn't always enough when the love exists alongside contradictions, careful constructions, and emotional games. There were other surprising elements too. Engelson began noticing small manipulations that, at first, seemed insignificant. A conversation reframed to favor her perspective. A story retold to highlight her resilience or cleverness. Moments designed to position her as the protagonist, even in minor incidents. At first, he overlooked these, they were subtle. But over time, they became impossible to ignore. It wasn't malicious, it was just part of her way of navigating a complex world, but it left him questioning what was real and what was calculated. And then came the tipping point. The realization that the public persona, the smiling, charming, confident woman the world admired, was only part of the story. The private reality was far more layered, far more complex. And Trevor Engelson, living it, seeing it, experiencing it, began to feel a tension that he couldn't shake. A tension that would eventually shape his perspective, his decisions, and the revelations he would later share with the world. It's hard to describe exactly how exhausting it can be to love someone so brilliant, so magnetic, yet so unpredictable. Trevor recounts moments where he questioned his own perceptions, doubted his own instincts, and struggled to reconcile the woman he loved with the patterns he observed. And through it all, he kept one thought in mind. Love doesn't always make things clear. Sometimes, it obscures, it confuses, it blurs the lines between reality and perception. But here's the shocking truth. The tension, the contradictions, the subtle manipulations, they were only the beginning. Trevor Engelson would soon witness moments that revealed even deeper complexities, behaviors that went beyond personality traits or relational dynamics. And as he looked closer, as he tried to make sense of it all, he realized something that would shock him to his core. Because living behind the glamour isn't just about navigating public scrutiny, it's about navigating someone's entire persona. The smiles, the charm, the allure, they hide layers that few people ever see. Engelson had been in the eye of that storm, and what he discovered was more than he ever expected. The contradictions, the strategies, the hidden truths, they were all part of a larger picture. And just when he thought he had a handle on it, Just when he began to piece together the patterns, an event occurred that forced everything into sharp focus. A moment that revealed the depth of complexity, the stakes, and the emotional cost of loving someone who lived much of their life as a carefully curated performance. Have you ever ignored a warning because it seemed too small to matter, only to realize later it was glaring? That's exactly how Trevor Engelson felt as he navigated the early stages of his engagement with Meghan Markle. At first, the red flags were subtle, easily dismissed as quirks or stress. But over time, patterns emerged, and what seemed minor became impossible to ignore. The first red flag appeared in conversations that seemed ordinary on the surface, but carried an undercurrent of control. Small things, where they would eat, who they would see, how social media was curated. These weren't dramatic confrontations. They were quiet nudges that guided behavior, shaping the world around her subtly but deliberately. Engelson recalls wondering if he was overreacting, questioning whether his instincts were too sensitive, or if he was misreading signals. But deep down, he felt uneasy. Trevor describes the moment he realized these weren't isolated incidents. He noticed that certain behaviors repeated across contexts, people, and interactions. When Meghan wanted something, there was an expectation, not an ask, but an expectation that it would be met. Requests were framed in ways that left little room for negotiation. Decisions that seemed collaborative on the surface often had hidden pressures. And the tension wasn't confrontational. It was quiet, calculated, almost invisible to an outsider. It wasn't just about control in the small moments. Engelson also began noticing inconsistencies in the stories she told. Minor exaggerations at first, then slight misrepresentations of events, retold in ways that subtly shifted blame or enhanced her image. The pattern was familiar to anyone who has dealt with manipulation. Small distortions that, over time, create a completely different perception of reality. And Engelson, living through it, couldn't ignore the feeling that he was navigating a reality that didn't fully align with the truth. Humor, he says, became a tool as well. Meghan had a way of delivering jokes that could charm anyone in the room, but occasionally carried an edge that left him questioning her intentions. Sometimes, a joke felt like a test. Sometimes, it felt like a warning. And when taken together with other patterns, these moments added up to something he couldn't rationalize away. Then there were the moments of emotional subtlety that many wouldn't recognize as red flags, but Engelson did. Slight dismissals of his feelings, moments where his perspective was minimized, gestures that implied his opinion didn't carry weight. Each instance alone might have been brushed off, but combined, they painted a picture of someone intensely aware of the emotional landscape around her and skilled at shaping it. It wasn't all negative, of course. Engelson loved her. He admired her ambition, her charisma, her ability to inspire. But love, he realized, could blind you to patterns that outsiders would see immediately. He would reconcile moments of warmth and tenderness with moments of tension, trying to understand them in context, trying to hold on to the person he had fallen for. But the contradictions persisted, growing more apparent over time. Audience, think about this. Have you ever been in a situation where someone's behavior made you question your own judgment? Where the love and admiration you felt coexisted with unease and doubt? That's exactly what Engelson experienced. The red flags were never overt. They were woven into the fabric of daily life, subtle and persistent, impossible to ignore once he began to notice the pattern. There were also surprising contradictions that left him unsettled. Meghan could be incredibly generous with friends, but transactional with others. She could be playful and warm in one context, then cold and calculating in another. Engelson realized that these weren't accidental contradictions. They were deliberate choices in navigating her relationships, her public image, and the world around her. And living with someone who operated this way was both captivating and exhausting. Trevor also describes the pressure of expectation. Being engaged to someone whose life was under constant scrutiny added another layer of complexity. Every choice, every word, every interaction carried weight. It wasn't enough to simply live life. One had to navigate it strategically, often in ways that felt unnatural or draining. Engelson noticed that Meghan was adept at this. She could manage perception effortlessly, and while this skill impressed many, It also created tension in private moments where he felt that genuine connection was sometimes sacrificed for image. As the engagement progressed, the red flags became more pronounced. Moments of subtle manipulation turned into patterns of strategic decision-making that affected not just their relationship, but interactions with friends, family, and even the media. Engelson began to recognize that what he had once interpreted as minor quirks were actually indicators of larger personality traits, traits that would later inform his understanding of who she really was, behind the glamour and charm. And yet, he kept trying. He kept giving the benefit of the doubt. He kept trying to reconcile love, admiration, and instinctive unease. That's the complicated nature of relationships. You see warning signs, but hope, affection, and history create a powerful counterweight. Trevor describes this internal conflict in vivid terms. The push and pull between loving someone and realizing that love may blind you to patterns that are impossible to ignore. Audience, ask yourself, how long would you stay in a situation where the red flags keep piling up? How many subtle warnings can you dismiss before reality becomes undeniable? Engelson reached a point where reflection became unavoidable. He couldn't ignore the signs anymore, no matter how much he wanted the relationship to succeed. The inconsistencies, the subtle control, the emotional complexity, they demanded attention, understanding, and ultimately, decisions. And just when he thought he had identified the key patterns, the behaviors escalated. What had once been subtle nudges became more pronounced. Decisions were framed as tests of loyalty. Stories were retold with subtle emphasis on her perspective, often casting others, including Engelson himself, in a less favorable light. And while he loved her, he began to feel increasingly trapped in a cycle where his emotions were constantly evaluated, his decisions subtly guided, and his perceptions questioned. The culmination of these red flags was not dramatic in a single moment. It was cumulative. Engelson realized that what he had been observing over time, the subtle inconsistencies, the emotional tests, the contradictions, formed a picture that he could no longer ignore. And while he still cared for Meghan deeply, he recognized that loving her didn't equate to understanding her fully or being able to navigate the complexities she presented. And just when he was beginning to process all of this, something happened. An incident so revealing, so stark, that it forced him to confront the truth head-on. A moment that left him questioning everything he had believed, everything he had hoped for, and everything he thought he knew about the person he had loved. Have you ever had a moment that makes you stop in your tracks? A moment that changes everything you thought you knew about a relationship, about a person, about yourself? For Trevor Engelson, that moment came during a seemingly ordinary day. One of those days that, in hindsight, carried the weight of a storm no one could see coming. Up until this point, Trevor had been navigating a maze of contradictions. He had grown accustomed to the push and pull, the warmth followed by subtle coldness, the charm interlaced with control. He loved Meghan, truly, deeply, but love alone wasn't enough to make sense of the patterns he was beginning to see. And then, everything crystallized in one defining incident, one event that illuminated the complexity, the intensity, and the stakes of the life he was living with her. It began innocuously, a conversation, a simple disagreement about plans that should have been minor. But the way Meghan responded startled him. She wasn't angry, exactly, not in a way that was easy to identify. It was something quieter, sharper, more calculated. She made a comment that, at first, seemed like a joke, but carried an unmistakable undertone. A subtle assertion of control, a reminder that even in moments that should have been collaborative, the final word, or the narrative, belonged to her. Trevor remembers the moment vividly. He felt a chill in his chest, a sense of unease that he couldn't shake. Something about the way she framed her words, the precision of her timing, the controlled emotion, suggested that this was not merely a one-off. This was part of a broader pattern he had been noticing, a pattern that now revealed itself in sharp relief. For a long time, Trevor had tried to rationalize. He told himself, maybe it's stress. Maybe it's the pressures of life in the public eye. Maybe I'm imagining things. But this time, rationalization wasn't enough. The energy in the room was unmistakable. He was being evaluated, measured, and subtly challenged. And he realized that he had been operating under this reality for months. years, even, without fully acknowledging it. The turning point didn't stop there. Soon, other moments followed in rapid succession. Conversations where his opinions were dismissed, gestures that were designed to elicit a response, interactions that subtly shifted power dynamics. Engelson began to see that these weren't isolated incidents. They were a deliberate pattern of behavior, a reflection of someone who understood influence and perception at a level most people never encounter. And here's what made it even more striking. These moments weren't always negative. They were wrapped in charm, delivered with grace, cloaked in humor or warmth. It was the duality that made it so difficult to confront. He could love the person in front of him, the one who laughed, who cared, who seemed genuine, while simultaneously recognizing the patterns that left him unsettled. The complexity was dizzying, almost disorienting. Audience, think about it. Have you ever felt torn between the person you love and the behaviors that unsettle you? Have you ever had to reconcile charm with control, affection with strategy, warmth with subtle manipulation? Trevor Engelson was living that reality every single day, and the turning point made it impossible to ignore. Trevor began documenting, mentally cataloging moments that seemed minor at the time but were now revealing a bigger picture. A look, a tone, a story told in a way that shifted perception. Small actions that, when viewed together, painted a picture of someone intensely aware of her influence, her image, and the emotional landscape of those around her. It wasn't malicious, Engelson insists. It was strategic, deliberate, and incredibly skillful. But for someone living inside it, it was exhausting and destabilizing. And then came the most disorienting moment of all, an event that forced Trevor to confront the reality he had been piecing together. Something happened. Something personal, private, that highlighted the duality he had been experiencing for months. It was an action that outwardly seemed harmless, even charming. But beneath the surface, it carried a message, a subtle assertion of dominance, a demonstration of influence, a quiet test of loyalty and patience. Trevor describes the feeling as a shockwave, a mix of disbelief, hurt, admiration, and fear. It was a moment that crystallized all the small inconsistencies, all the red flags, all the contradictions he had been observing. Suddenly, the patterns were undeniable. The love, the charm, the intimacy, all of it existed alongside a keen awareness of strategy, of perception, of control. And Engelson realized he could no longer separate one from the other. This turning point also revealed something unexpected, the extent to which the world outside had no idea. Friends, family, colleagues. They saw the smiling Meghan, the poised Meghan, the confident Meghan. They didn't see the subtle tests, the emotional navigation, the intricate strategies that shaped her behavior behind closed doors. And Engelson understood something that would haunt him. Living with her privately was a vastly different experience than observing her publicly. And here's the truth. The turning point wasn't just emotional, it was revelatory. It showed Engelson that the relationship he had believed in, the connection he had cherished, was far more complex than he could have imagined. It wasn't just a love story. It wasn't just a fairy tale romance. It was a dynamic of power, influence, and perception that demanded constant attention, constant adjustment, and constant self-reflection. And yet, despite the shock, despite the unease, despite the red flags becoming impossible to ignore, Trevor still felt conflicted. He loved Meghan. He admired her. He respected her. And that love, that admiration, that respect made it almost impossible to confront the full reality. Love, he realized, doesn't make life simple. It complicates it, colors it, confuses perception, and makes facing truth harder than it should be. But just when Engelson thought he had reached the limits of his understanding, just when he had accepted the complexity and learned to navigate it, the situation escalated in a way that was impossible to ignore. An incident occurred, a private, personal moment that revealed not only the depth of her personality, but also the far-reaching implications of living with someone whose charm and strategy were inseparable. Audience, here's the question. What would you do if the person you loved most revealed a side of themselves you hadn't seen before? A side that was not malevolent, but undeniable, calculated, and strategic? A side that changed everything you thought you knew about them? For Trevor, the answer came in the form of confrontation, reflection, and ultimately, a decision that would alter the course of their relationship, and eventually, the revelations that would shock the public. And then came the moment nobody expected, a moment so revealing, so intense, that it left Engelson questioning the foundations of their entire relationship. A moment that not only confirmed the patterns he had been observing, but also set the stage for the insights and disclosures he would later share with the world. Have you ever felt that moment when everything you thought you knew starts unraveling? That moment when tiny inconsistencies suddenly connect, revealing a picture you couldn't have imagined? For Trevor Engelson, that moment arrived quietly, but it hit harder than anything he'd experienced before. After the turning point, life with Meghan Markle became a delicate balance between charm and strategy. Trevor began noticing patterns that he could no longer ignore. Small details, once brushed off, suddenly carried weight. A choice of words, the timing of a story, the subtle way she controlled how events were framed. These weren't dramatic betrayals, not yet, but they were glimpses into a deeper side of her personality, one that was calculated, ambitious, and highly aware of perception. Trevor recalls a particular evening that still sticks with him. They were hosting a dinner with a few close friends, an intimate gathering by Hollywood standards. Everything appeared normal on the surface. Laughter, shared stories, polite conversation. But under the surface, Engelson could feel the patterns he had been observing for months taking shape. Meghan subtly redirected conversations, carefully highlighted certain achievements while downplaying others, and positioned herself as the center of attention in a way that felt intentional, not incidental. At first, he tried to rationalize. Maybe she's just charming, he thought. Maybe she's just confident. But confidence alone doesn't explain the precise way she framed events, nudged narratives, and managed perceptions. It was strategic, and it was deliberate. Engelson began documenting these moments mentally, creating a mental map of patterns and behaviors that were invisible to outsiders but undeniable in the private sphere. And then the secrets started to surface. These weren't shocking scandals or tabloid fodder, at least not yet. They were subtler, more personal revelations that peeled back the layers of what he had believed was a fairy tale romance. He noticed how carefully she controlled information, who she shared it with, and how even the smallest details were managed for maximum impact. Trevor describes it as realizing that the person he loved wasn't just charming. She was masterful at shaping reality to fit her narrative. Audience, think about this. How would you react if the person you trusted most revealed hidden layers you hadn't anticipated? Layers that didn't make them bad, but revealed a level of strategic thinking and self-awareness that you weren't prepared for? That's what Engelson was facing. Love complicated the issue. Admiration clouded judgment. But the truth was becoming undeniable. Meghan Markle's private reality was far more complex than anyone could have imagined. Engelson began noticing other patterns, too. Subtle manipulations of social situations, careful control over interactions, and the way she framed events to her advantage. These were skills that impressed most people but left him emotionally drained. It was exhausting to live in a world where charm and strategy were inseparable. And the more he observed, the clearer it became that the public persona, the confident, charismatic, seemingly effortless Meghan, was only part of the story. The secrets also extended into their personal lives. Trevor noticed discrepancies between what she said publicly and what she did privately. Stories retold in ways that subtly shifted perspectives, gestures framed to create impact, and interactions managed with an awareness that few people could detect. Engelson realized he was witnessing a dynamic most people never saw, the private reality of someone living much of their life as a carefully curated performance. What made it even more striking was the emotional intensity. Meghan could be incredibly warm, incredibly affectionate, incredibly loving, and then, in the same day, display subtle behaviors that left him questioning his perceptions, his judgments, and even his reality. The push and pull was constant, making him simultaneously crave closeness and fear vulnerability. It was a roller coaster that few outside the relationship could comprehend, and Engelson felt the weight of it every single day. Trevor also began to see patterns in how she navigated friendships and social circles. Alliances were nurtured, but some relationships were deliberately distanced or controlled. The way she curated who had influence and who didn't became apparent to him, and it revealed a level of strategic thinking that was both impressive and unsettling. Living inside this dynamic, he realized, was not simple. It was a high-stakes game of perception, influence, and emotional navigation. And then came a revelation that shook him more than anything he had previously observed. A private conversation, a subtle disclosure, hinted at ambitions and behaviors that were hidden beneath the surface charm. It wasn't scandalous in a tabloid sense, but it was deeply telling about character, priorities, and the way she perceived relationships. Engelson describes it as a moment where the puzzle pieces finally began to align. The inconsistencies, the patterns, the contradictions. They were part of a larger, undeniable picture. Audience, ask yourself, what would you do if the person you loved most revealed aspects of themselves that challenged everything you thought you knew? Would you confront it? Ignore it? Rationalize it? For Engelson, the choice wasn't simple. Love made it complicated. Admiration made it confusing. But the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The secrets, the patterns, the hidden strategies. They all pointed to a reality that required recognition, reflection, and ultimately, decisions. And then, just when Trevor thought he had a handle on these emerging truths, another revelation arrived. Something he hadn't anticipated, something that challenged his assumptions about loyalty, honesty, and the way she managed relationships. This new discovery was a turning point, not only in his understanding of Meghan Markle, but in his approach to their relationship. It was a moment that made him realize just how layered and strategic she truly was. How careful she had been in presenting herself publicly versus privately. How subtle, yet impactful her influence could be. And how challenging it was for anyone to navigate that duality without feeling manipulated, confused, or emotionally drained. Trevor Engelson would later reflect that this period, the surfacing of secrets, was both illuminating and painful. Illuminating because it revealed patterns and truths he hadn't fully recognized. Painful because it forced him to confront contradictions, inconsistencies, and behaviors that complicated love in ways he wasn't prepared for. The picture he was now seeing was complete in a way that left little room for denial, yet he still wrestled with the emotional weight of what he had learned. But just when he thought he had begun to reconcile these revelations, the next incident occurred. A private, deeply personal moment that escalated everything. A moment that would push him to confront reality head-on and forced him to recognize that some truths couldn't be ignored or rationalized away. Have you ever realized that what the world sees is only the tip of the iceberg? That behind the smiles, the charisma, and the charm lies a complex, sometimes turbulent reality? For Trevor Engelson, living with Meghan Markle meant confronting private battles that no one else could see. And that would forever change his understanding of her. After the secrets began surfacing, the relationship entered a new phase. What had once been subtle inconsistencies became private conflicts, emotional push and pull that left Engelson questioning not just the dynamics of the relationship, but his own judgment. These were not public scandals. They weren't arguments in front of cameras or dramatic tabloid headlines. They were quiet, emotionally charged moments. Intense, personal, and deeply revealing. One of the first private battles involved control over daily life. Trevor noticed that small, seemingly innocuous choices became charged. Decisions about meals, travel plans, and even how friends were invited into their lives were navigated with precision. Meghan's approach wasn't overtly confrontational. It wasn't about yelling or manipulation in the traditional sense. It was more subtle. A gentle redirection, a carefully worded suggestion, a smile that masked the expectation behind it. And Engelson, trying to maintain harmony, found himself constantly negotiating these tiny, high-stakes dynamics. Then came the emotional tests. Engelson recalls moments when casual conversations suddenly felt like assessments of loyalty or commitment. A remark that seemed innocent could carry a weighty implication. A joke could be a subtle probe. A compliment could mask a challenge. And while these moments were often wrapped in warmth and charm, Engelson couldn't shake the sense that he was navigating a labyrinth designed to measure him at every turn. Audience, consider this. Have you ever felt that someone's affection came with invisible conditions, tests that were impossible to fail because the rules were unclear? That's exactly the emotional landscape Engelson was navigating. Love and admiration were entwined with complexity and subtle power dynamics, leaving him both captivated and constantly alert. Another layer of private battles involved trust. Trevor began noticing that small omissions, slight reframings, and retold stories created uncertainty. They weren't lies in the traditional sense, but they were enough to make him question what was true, what was exaggerated, and what was carefully curated to maintain control. He found himself replaying conversations, analyzing interactions, and second-guessing not just her words, but his own perceptions. It was exhausting, but necessary to understand the reality he was living in. And yet, despite the growing tension, there were moments that felt real. Quiet nights, shared laughter, gestures of affection that seemed genuine, intimate conversations where the world outside disappeared. These moments created emotional contradictions. He loved her deeply, but the private battles drained him. He admired her brilliance, but her strategic approach to relationships and perception left him wary. The duality was constant, creating a sense of both attachment and instability. Trevor also observed how Meghan managed external relationships even in private. Friends, family, and colleagues were part of a carefully curated social ecosystem. Alliances were nurtured, others distanced. Conversations were subtly guided to ensure that perception remained aligned with her narrative. Engelson realized that these weren't just social strategies. They were extensions of the same behaviors he had observed in their private life: control, influence, and precision. And then there were the contradictions. Moments of warmth immediately followed by subtle coldness. Moments of generosity juxtaposed with calculated self-interest. Moments that left him wondering, is this who she really is? Or is this the persona she crafts for each interaction? Engelson describes it as emotionally dizzying, constantly navigating between admiration, confusion, love, and unease. These private battles also revealed unexpected insights into Meghan's personality. She was highly intelligent, deeply aware of influence, and remarkably strategic. The same traits that drew people to her, that made her charismatic and magnetic, were also the traits that complicated private life. Engelson began to see that love alone couldn't reconcile the challenges of navigating a relationship with someone whose life operated on multiple levels of performance, perception, and strategic calculation. Audience, ask yourself this. How would you handle a relationship where brilliance and charm are inseparable from strategy and control? Where love coexists with subtle tests, emotional contradictions, and constant self-reflection? That was Trevor Engelson's daily reality. And it pushed him to confront his own emotions, boundaries, and understanding of trust in ways few outsiders could imagine. The stakes grew when private battles spilled into public perception. Even small disagreements, if not carefully managed, could create ripples that affected public image, friends, and family. Engelson noticed how every interaction, no matter how private, was part of a larger narrative that Meghan navigated expertly. And the realization was both impressive and daunting. Living in this environment required constant awareness, emotional agility, and sometimes quiet compromise. But perhaps the most revealing private battles were the ones that tested loyalty. Engelson describes moments where subtle challenges revealed priorities, intentions, and character traits that were invisible to the public. These were moments that required introspection. Should he adapt, confront, or step back? Love complicated the decisions, as did admiration for her intelligence and strategic skill. But he realized that navigating these battles was teaching him lessons about human behavior, emotional resilience, and the complex interplay between charm, strategy, and love. And then, just when he felt he had a grasp on the private complexities, another incident occurred, a moment that crystallized everything he had been observing. A revelation that underscored the duality of warmth and calculation, charm and control, strategy and love. It was a moment so subtle, yet so impactful that it would leave him questioning not only the relationship, but the very way he understood human behavior and perception. Have you ever been blindsided by a truth so unexpected that it shakes the foundation of everything you believed? Trevor Engelson experienced that very moment. A revelation that caught him completely off guard, a truth that would forever alter how he viewed the person he loved. The the relationship he cherished, and even his own judgment. It happened on an ordinary day, one of those days that seemed mundane but carried the weight of hidden significance. Engelson recalls it clearly. A conversation, simple at first, became a window into a side of Meghan Markle that few, if any, had seen. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was unmistakable. The tone, the choice of words, the subtle emphasis on control, it revealed intentions and motivations that were previously hidden. Trevor realized in that moment that what he had been witnessing over months and years wasn't merely quirks or personality traits. It was a carefully constructed persona, a blend of charm, strategy, and selective vulnerability. A person who could captivate a room, command attention, and simultaneously navigate private relationships with precision. And that realization hit him with both admiration and unease. Audience, think about this. What would you do if the person you trusted most revealed that there was an entire layer of themselves you had never fully seen? A layer that wasn't malevolent, but meticulous, calculated, and deeply strategic? That's exactly the revelation Engelson faced. The love and connection were real, but intertwined with patterns of behavior that challenged perception, trust, and even his own emotional boundaries. This revelation also clarified many of the contradictions he had noticed. The warmth paired with coldness, the generosity paired with subtle self-interest, the charm paired with calculated control. All of it was part of a cohesive, deliberate approach to navigating life, relationships, and perception. Engelson began to see these patterns not as random inconsistencies, but as deliberate behaviors tied to ambition, self-preservation, and influence. And yet, despite the clarity this revelation brought, it was emotionally jarring. Engelson had to reconcile the person he loved with the strategic, meticulous individual he now fully understood. It wasn't a simple task. Admiration clashed with doubt, affection clashed with caution, and love clashed with the need to protect himself from emotional manipulation. It was an internal battle that left him questioning not just the relationship, but his own perceptions and instincts. What made the revelation more intense was how subtle it had been until that moment. Months of observations, small behaviors, tiny inconsistencies. All of these had been pointing toward a pattern, but it wasn't until this key incident that the picture became undeniable. Engelson realized he had been navigating a complex dynamic without fully seeing the strategy behind it, and that realization forced a new level of introspection. Trevor also noticed how this revelation aligned with public perception, but only partially. The world saw the confident, poised, charismatic Meghan. Friends, family, and colleagues saw her charm and warmth. But what Engelson now understood, the private strategy, the emotional navigation, the control of perception, was invisible to outsiders. And that invisibility created tension. He loved her, yet he understood aspects of her personality that could never be shared publicly without being misinterpreted. Audience, ask yourself, how would you reconcile loving someone whose private complexity is invisible to the world, but undeniable to you? How do you process admiration for intelligence and charm alongside awareness of manipulation and strategic control? That was the daily reality for Engelson. A reality that required emotional agility, self-reflection, and the difficult task of balancing love with awareness. The revelation also highlighted the stakes involved. Meghan's awareness of influence, perception, and relationships wasn't simply a personal trait. It affected every interaction, every decision, and even how Engelson navigated his own behavior. He realized that living with someone so strategically aware required constant attentiveness, subtle negotiation, and an understanding that what appeared simple on the surface was often layered with intention. And then came another layer, one that surprised Engelson even more. He discovered behaviors and choices that extended beyond private dynamics and into public influence. How stories were presented, how events were framed, how interactions were subtly guided to create perception advantages. All of it revealed a depth of strategic thinking that was both impressive and emotionally taxing. Engelson realized he wasn't just in a personal relationship. He was living alongside someone who navigated life with a level of calculation few could comprehend. But here's what made this revelation truly shocking. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't cruel. It was simply part of who she was, a combination of brilliance, strategy, and self-awareness that shaped her every decision. And while Engelson admired these qualities, he also recognized the emotional toll of being intimately involved with someone whose life operated on multiple levels simultaneously. As this understanding deepened, Engelson began to connect past experiences, the subtle tests, the contradictions, the emotional push and pull, with this revelation. Each previously puzzling moment suddenly made sense. Each small inconsistency, each behavioral nuance, each private challenge revealed a broader pattern. And it became clear that the private person he loved and the public persona were both real, but they were components of a carefully managed, multifaceted identity. Audience, think about it. How would you navigate loving someone whose complexity is so vast that it can feel like living two lives at once? That's exactly what Engelson faced. The reality of a relationship where charm, warmth, and strategy coexisted, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes in tension, always requiring awareness, care, and reflection. And just when Engelson thought he had fully processed this revelation, the next shock arrived, an incident that would force him to confront not only the depths of her strategic nature, but also the emotional consequences of living with someone whose private reality was as layered as it was.